Hey guys, tonight we are going to unravel the history of one of the oldest and most magical living things that humans have ever partnered with. We're going to trace the long, slow, and patient story of the sourdough starter. Imagine the warm, comforting smell of a loaf of bread baking, the gentle, rhythmic bubbling of a happy starter in its jar, the incredible feeling of turning simple flour and water into something alive, something that connects you directly to thousands of years of human history. Let's be honest, given that our first bakers didn't know the difference between friendly yeast and toxic mold, you probably wouldn't survive the trial and error phase of this delicious discovery. But tonight, we're not worried about food poisoning, we're just here to enjoy the story. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's a small click for you, but it makes a huge difference for the channel. And feel free to post your location and local time in the comments, it's always amazing to see where everyone is listening from as we start this journey. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins not in a modern, stainless steel kitchen, but under the hot, brilliant sun of the ancient world. You are in the Fertile Crescent, perhaps in ancient Egypt, thousands of years ago. You live by the rhythms of the great river Nile. The world is a cycle of flood and sun, of planting and harvest. Your life is tied to the grain, the emmer wheat and the barley that grow in the rich, black earth left behind by the river's annual inundation. And for as long as anyone can remember, bread has been the staff of your life. But the bread you know is a simple, humble thing. You take the hard grains and you grind them, a slow, laborious process, crushing them between two heavy, flat stones until you have a rough, sandy flour. You mix this flour with a little water from the river, kneading it into a stiff paste. You shape this paste into thin, flat discs, and you cook them quickly on a scorching hot stone placed in the embers of your fire. The result is bread, yes, but it is a hard, dense, chewy cracker. It is unleavened. It is filling and it gives you strength for the day's work, but it is a purely functional food, devoid of lightness or delight. One hot afternoon, you are preparing for the evening meal. You mix a pot of crushed grain and water, intending to make a simple porridge. But as you are working, you are distracted. Perhaps a child cries out, needing your attention. Perhaps a neighbor stops by to share a piece of gossip. Perhaps the heat of the day simply overwhelms you, and you leave your work to seek the cool shade of a palm tree. For whatever reason, the pot of gruel is forgotten. You leave it sitting outside your small, mud brick home, under the relentless, baking heat of the Egyptian sun. You don't return to it until the next day. As you approach the clay pot, you notice something is wrong. The surface of the gruel, which should be still and inert, is bubbling. Small, lazy bubbles are rising to the surface and popping, as if the mixture were alive. You lean in closer. A strange smell rises to meet you. It is not the smell of rot or decay, not entirely. It is a sharp, sour, tangy smell, with a faint, fruity aroma like fermenting dates or the beer that the brewers make down by the river. You are suspicious. Your first instinct is that it has spoiled, that it has been corrupted by some unseen spirit in the air. But grain is precious. Every handful of flour is the result of immense labor, of planting, harvesting, threshing, and grinding. You cannot afford to waste it. With a shrug of resignation, you decide to cook the strange, bubbling mixture anyway, perhaps to burn away whatever has taken hold of it. You add more flour to the strange, living paste to thicken it, and you shape it into a rough loaf, just as you have always done. You place it on the hot stone to bake. And then, the miracle happens. As the dough heats up, it begins to rise. It puffs up, growing larger and lighter, something no bread you have ever made has done before. When you take it from the fire, it is not the hard, flat cracker you were expecting. It is a rounded, golden brown loaf, its crust cracked and beautiful. It is lighter in your hand than any bread you have ever held. You break it open, and the inside is not dense and heavy, but soft, airy, and full of a network of beautiful, irregular holes. You take a bite. The flavor is a revelation. It is complex, tangy, and deeply satisfying, with a subtle sourness that makes your mouth water. It is the most delicious thing you have ever tasted. You have, entirely by accident, stumbled upon one of the greatest culinary discoveries in human history. You have harnessed the invisible, magical power of wild fermentation. You have made the world's first sourdough bread. Food historians still argue about the specifics of this discovery. Was it truly a forgotten pot of porridge like yours, or was the leavening power of the yeast-rich foam, or barm, from beer brewing discovered first and then deliberately applied to bread. The ancient Egyptians used the very same hieroglyph for both baker and brewer, showing just how intertwined these two magical arts of fermentation were in their world. But your discovery is not yet complete. The true miracle comes a few days later. You have saved a small lump of the strange, bubbly dough from that first magical batch. You have kept it in a clay pot. Out of curiosity, you feed it, adding a little more flour and water. And you watch in amazement as it comes back to life, bubbling and growing, filling the pot with the same sour, fruity, living aroma. You realize you have not just made a single loaf of bread. You have captured the magic. You have created a living thing, a culture, a starter, that you can keep alive indefinitely, simply by feeding it. As long as you care for this strange, bubbling paste, you will be able to replicate the miracle of light, airy, delicious bread forever. You look at the humble clay pot with a new sense of reverence and awe. It contains not just flour and water, but an invisible, powerful, and life-giving force. It is a gift from the gods, a secret whispered to you by the warm sun and the wild, invisible spirits in the air. It is a responsibility, a sacred trust. You are no longer just a baker, you are a custodian of life, the keeper of an ancient, bubbling magic. You stand before the humble clay pot, your mind filled with a sense of wonder and a little bit of fear. This bubbling, living paste is a mystery, a magical gift. You don't understand how it works, only that it does. You only know that if you care for it, if you feed it, it will in turn give you the gift of light, airy, and delicious bread. But now, let's leave your perspective as the ancient baker for a moment. Let's use the magic of our modern knowledge to zoom in, to shrink ourselves down to a size smaller than a grain of sand, and to go on a quiet, gentle safari into the invisible, bustling world that exists inside your starter. As we descend into the jar, the thick, sticky mixture of flour and water transforms into a vast, starchy landscape. We are floating in a world of massive, suspended particles of protein and carbohydrate, a sweet and nourishing universe. And it is a universe that is teeming with life. The first inhabitants we meet are the wild yeasts. They are everywhere, these tiny, single-celled fungi. They are floating on invisible currents in the warm Egyptian air. They are clinging to the husks of the very grain you ground into flour, and they are even present on the skin of your own hands. They are like tiny, dormant seeds, waiting for the perfect conditions to awaken. And your pot of flour and water is that perfect condition. When one of these wild yeast spores lands in this warm, wet, sugary world, it wakes up and does what all living things do. It begins to eat. It feasts on the simple sugars present in the flour, and as it metabolizes this food, it begins to exhale. But it does not breathe out the same air we do. The waste product of its meal, its tiny burp, is carbon dioxide gas. These are the bubbles you see rising to the surface of your starter. When you later mix this starter into a larger batch of dough, millions of these tiny yeasts get trapped in the sticky, elastic network of gluten. As they continue to exhale their carbon dioxide, they create millions of tiny gas pockets that cause the entire loaf to expand, to rise, to become light and airy. The yeast is the engine of the bread's lift. But the yeast is not alone in this microscopic world. There is another, equally important inhabitant, bacteria. Now, we often think of bacteria as something to be feared, a source of sickness and decay. But the bacteria in your starter are not only friendly, they are essential partners. They are various species of lactobacillus, the very same family of beneficial bacteria that are used to turn milk into yogurt and cheese. These bacteria, just like the yeast, are found everywhere in the environment, and they too are drawn to the feast of sugar you have provided in your pot. They also eat the sugars in the flour, but their waste products are different. They produce acids, primarily lactic acid, which gives yogurt its tangy flavor, and acetic acid, which gives vinegar its sour sharpness. These two acids are the secret to sourdough's unique character. First, they provide the flavor. The complex, tangy, and slightly sour taste of the bread you made is a direct result of these acids produced by the bacteria. Without them, you would have a light but rather plain-tasting loaf. The bacteria provide the soul. Second, and perhaps more importantly, these acids act as a natural preservative. The acids lower the pH of the dough, creating a hostile environment where other, less friendly microbes, like the molds that quickly spoil other foods, simply cannot survive. This is why a loaf of naturally leavened sourdough bread stays fresh for much longer than other breads. The bacteria are the bread's personal bodyguards. What you have cultivated in your simple clay pot is not just a single living thing, but a complex, stable, and beautifully symbiotic ecosystem. The yeast and the bacteria have formed a perfect partnership. The acids produced by the bacteria protect the yeast from competing molds and other microbes. In turn, some byproducts of the yeast's metabolism can provide food for the bacteria. They create a balanced community, a living culture where each partner helps the other to thrive. And this microscopic community is unique to you. The specific strains of wild yeast and bacteria that have populated your starter are a direct reflection of your environment. This concept is what vintners call terroir. It's the idea that the unique qualities of a local environment, the soil, the climate, the air, give a wine its distinctive character. Your sourdough starter has its own terroir. The yeasts floating in the air of your particular village, the bacteria living on the grain from your specific field, even the microbes on your own hands, have all contributed to creating a starter with a flavor and character that is unique in all the world. Microbiologists are still unraveling the full complexity of these relationships, but you, the ancient baker, you learn it all through simple, patient observation. You learn that when the bubbling slows, the starter is hungry, and you must feed it with fresh flour and water. You learn that it is happiest and most active in the warmth, just as it was when it was first born in the sun. You learn that if the sour smell becomes too sharp, it is out of balance, and that by discarding a portion before feeding, you can refresh the culture and restore its gentle, fruity aroma. You look at the bubbling pot with a new and deeper awe. The magic has not been dispelled by this knowledge, it has been magnified. You are not just the keeper of a single magical creature. You are the custodian of an entire, invisible world. You are a shepherd to a microscopic flock of yeast and a farmer to a tiny field of bacteria. You have harnessed not just a force of nature, but a whole living, breathing ecosystem in a jar. And this profound, intimate partnership between human and microbe, begun by accident on a hot afternoon, will form the very foundation of the art of bread making for the next 5,000 years. You stand in the hot, dry air of ancient Egypt, cradling the simple clay pot that holds the world's first sourdough starter. This living, breathing, bubbling magic you have captured feels like a personal secret, a domestic miracle. But secrets, especially ones as useful and as powerful as this, have a way of spreading. We'll leave you now, the accidental baker, and let our consciousness drift forward in time, across the deep blue of the Mediterranean Sea. The landscape of mud brick villages and papyrus reeds dissolves, replaced by the sight of stone-paved roads, magnificent marble temples, and the ceaseless, bustling energy of the greatest empire the world has ever known. You have arrived in ancient Rome. Your journey takes you down a busy city street, perhaps in the shadow of the great Colosseum itself, or in a prosperous town like Pompeii. The air is filled with the sounds of commerce, of rattling carts, and of 100 different voices speaking Latin. You are drawn by a familiar and comforting smell, the warm, toasty, and utterly wonderful aroma of baking bread. You follow the scent to its source, a building known as a pistrinum, a Roman bakery. This is a world away from your simple, domestic hearth in Egypt. Bread making in Rome is a serious, professional industry. You see huge, beehive-shaped brick ovens, their fiery mouths glowing with intense heat. In the center of the workshop, you see the massive stone mills used for grinding grain, turned not by hand, but by a blindfolded donkey or mule, patiently walking in an endless circle. This is baking on an almost industrial scale. The state itself had a vested interest in keeping the city's immense population fed. The policy of providing cheap or free grain and entertainment, the infamous bread and circuses, was essential for maintaining public order. This demand gave rise to a powerful class of professional bakers, who formed their own guilds, or collegia, and took immense pride in their craft. And at the heart of this professional enterprise, you find your old friend, the starter. But here, it is not just a humble pot of bubbling paste. Here, it is a priceless asset, a trade secret, the very soul of the bakery. It is known as the fermentum, or more poetically, the leaven. You watch the master baker, the pister, as he approaches a large earthenware crock that sits in a warm, protected corner of the room. He treats it with a reverence that borders on religious devotion. This is the mother starter, the source of every loaf of bread that comes out of his ovens. It is a living culture, an heirloom that has been in his family for generations, passed down from his father, and from his father's father before him. It carries within its bubbling depths the unique taste of this place, the specific wild yeasts and bacteria that give his bread its signature flavor and texture, a flavor that distinguishes his bakery from all the others in the city. No one is allowed to touch this mother starter except for him. It is guarded more jealously than gold. The daily ritual is a testament to this reverence. In the evening, after the day's baking is done, you watch the pister perform a crucial task. He does not use the precious mother starter for the next day's dough directly. Instead, he takes just a small spoonful of the mother and places it in a much larger bowl. To this, he adds a precise measure of flour and water, creating a large, fresh batch of active leaven. This new leaven will be used for tomorrow's bread, while the original mother remains safe and pure in her crock, her strength preserved. The next morning, long before dawn, the bakery is already a hive of activity. The new, active leaven, now bubbly and fragrant, is mixed with huge quantities of flour, water, and salt in a large kneading trough. You watch as strong, sweating bakers work the massive pile of dough, their movements rhythmic and powerful. They shape the dough into the characteristic Roman loaves, round, and scored with lines on top to create 8 or 9 wedges, making the loaf easy to break and share without a knife. You can see these very loaves, frozen in time, preserved as black, carbonized artifacts in the volcanic ash that buried the city of Pompeii. The baker's pride was immense. In Rome, you can still visit the strange and magnificent tomb of a man named Eurysaces, a former slave who became a fabulously wealthy baker and state contractor. His tomb is one of the most eccentric in the city, decorated with scenes depicting every stage of the bread-making process, from the grinding of the grain to the baking of the loaves in the oven. It is a powerful statement of the status and dignity that could be achieved through the mastery of this ancient art. As you watch a baker use a long wooden peel to slide the pale, scored loaves into the fiery mouth of the oven, you reflect on the journey of the starter. In Egypt, it was a domestic accident, a household magic. Here, in the heart of a bustling, pragmatic empire, it has become a professional tool, a symbol of tradition, quality, and commercial success. But it is still a living thing, it is still a partnership between human and microbe. And it is still an unbroken chain, a living, breathing, bubbling connection that links this noisy Roman bakery all the way back to that first, quiet, sun-drenched discovery on the banks of the Nile. The master baker, having used the day's leaven, now performs the final, crucial ritual. He takes a small lump of the freshly made bread dough and adds it back to his mother starter, feeding her, replenishing her, ensuring her life and the life of his bakery will continue for another day. It is a quiet act of continuity, a daily prayer to the invisible ecosystem that is the source of his livelihood, his identity, and his art. You stand in the noisy, bustling heart of a Roman bakery, a place of commerce, of industry, of pragmatic, large-scale production. The master baker carefully feeds his precious mother starter, a living asset that guarantees the quality and reputation of his business. But empires, no matter how great, are not eternal. We now let the image of Rome, with its stone-paved roads and its powerful legions, begin to crumble. The great imperial order frays at the edges and then collapses from within. The centuries that follow are a time of turmoil and upheaval, an era often called the Dark Ages. Cities shrink, trade routes become dangerous, and much of the practical knowledge of the ancient world is forgotten. In this chaotic new landscape, who will keep the flame of knowledge alive? Who will protect the living, bubbling flame of the sourdough starter? Our journey takes us forward several hundred years, into the heart of early medieval Europe. We leave the noise of the city behind and travel to a quiet, secluded river valley, surrounded by deep forests and green hills. Nestled in this valley, you see a collection of sturdy stone buildings, surrounded by a high wall. You hear the slow, rhythmic tolling of a great bronze bell and the faint, beautiful sound of men's voices joined together in a solemn chant. You have arrived at a monastery. In the wake of Rome's collapse, these secluded communities became the unlikely guardians of civilization. They were islands of order, peace, and learning in a sea of chaos. Guided by the rule of their founding saints, like Saint Benedict, the monks lived a disciplined life of prayer and work, or et labora. They were not just men of God, they were scholars, artists, scientists, and engineers. In their scriptoriums, they painstakingly copied and preserved the great literary and philosophical texts of the ancient world. And in their fields, workshops, and kitchens, they preserved the practical arts of agriculture, of brewing, and of baking. You pass through the monastery gatehouse and enter the quiet, orderly world within the walls. You are led to the bakehouse, the pistrinum of the monastery. The building is made of solid stone, its interior clean and well organized. It is a world away from the dusty, commercial bakery of Rome. Here, the work is done with a quiet, focused, and prayerful discipline. The baker is not a businessman, but a monk, a brother chosen for this vital task. He wears the simple, rough-spun habit of his order. His work is not a job, It is his sacred duty. He is responsible for providing the daily bread for his brothers, the very foundation of their simple, communal diet. The Benedictine rule allotted each monk a generous portion of bread each day, and in a life of fasting and austerity, it was a profound and necessary comfort. And at the heart of this monastic bakery, you see it again. Your old, familiar friend. In a large earthenware crock, kept in a warm spot near the great, domed oven, is the sourdough starter. Here, it is treated with a reverence that transcends its practical value. It is seen as a living gift from God. The mysterious process by which it transforms simple flour and water into light, nourishing bread is seen as a daily miracle, a tangible symbol of God's grace and the mystery of the resurrection. This starter may well be a direct, living descendant of the starters of the Roman world, a fragile, unbroken chain of life carried through the centuries of collapse, protected and nurtured behind these stone walls. The brother baker's work is a form of meditation. You watch as he feeds the starter, his movements slow and deliberate. He kneads the dough for the day's loaves, and you can see that his rhythmic, repetitive motions are a kind of physical prayer. The bread he makes serves many purposes. There is the coarse, dark loaf, often made from a mixture of wheat and rye called maslin, which will form the daily sustenance for the monks themselves. A portion of these loaves will also be given as alms to the poor and hungry who come to the monastery gates for charity. Then there is the finer bread, made from carefully sifted white flour, which will be used for the Eucharist at the altar, or served to important guests and pilgrims seeking shelter for the night. Historians debate the role of the monks in this era. Were they true innovators, actively experimenting with crop rotation, brewing techniques, and baking methods? Or were they primarily meticulous custodians of Roman knowledge, carefully preserving the old ways without significant change? Looking at the quiet, focused work of the brother baker, you sense it is a mixture of both, a deep respect for the ancient tradition, combined with a patient, daily quest for perfection in the service of God. You see in this quiet, sacred space a new spiritual dimension to the art of baking. The starter itself is a metaphor for faith, a small, humble thing that, with patient care and feeding, can grow and give life to the entire community. The rising of the dough is a symbol of hope and rebirth. The final, baked loaf is a testament to the transformative power of both physical and spiritual nourishment. The bell tolls again, calling the monks to prayer. The brother baker covers his dough with a linen cloth, wipes his hands, and makes the sign of the cross before leaving the bakehouse. But before he goes, he performs the final, crucial ritual. He takes a small piece of the dough he has just made and returns it to the mother starter, folding it in gently. He is feeding the culture, ensuring its life, its strength, and its continuity for the next day, and the day after that, and for the generations of monks to come. In an age of darkness and decay, you have found the light, not just in the monastery's library, but here, in its warm, quiet bakehouse, where a simple monk and his ancient, living starter are keeping one of the world's most important traditions alive. You stand in the quiet, holy bakehouse of a medieval monastery. Here, sheltered behind thick stone walls, the living culture in your starter has been protected, nurtured, and passed down through centuries of chaos. It is a symbol of preservation, of order, and of quiet, patient faith. But the world outside these walls is beginning to wake up. The Renaissance is blooming, trade routes are reopening, and a new age of discovery is dawning. Humanity is becoming restless, eager to explore the blank spaces on the map. And for your starter to join this new adventure, it must learn to travel. Our journey takes us forward in time, into the 16th or 17th century. The serene, cloistered world of the monastery dissolves, replaced by the noisy, chaotic, and exciting energy of a great European seaport. You are on the docks of a city like Lisbon or Plymouth. The air is thick with the smell of salt, tar, and fish, and the strange, enticing aromas of exotic spices being unloaded from a newly returned vessel. The sky above is a tangled forest of tall masts and rigging. Sailors from a dozen different nations shout to one another in a cacophony of languages. Great galleons and nimble caravels are being loaded with provisions for voyages that will last not for days or weeks, but for months, and sometimes even years. You are a ship's cook, or perhaps a simple sailor, preparing to embark on one of these grand, perilous journeys. You know what lies ahead, an endless expanse of ocean and a diet of almost unimaginable monotony. The staple food of the sailor is salted beef, so hard it must be soaked for hours before it can be chewed, and hardtack. Hardtack is a simple, unleavened biscuit made of flour, water, and salt, baked multiple times until it is as hard and as durable as a piece of wood. It is famously infested with weevils, but it does not spoil, and it will keep a man alive, if not happy. The thought of months with nothing but salt meat and weevily biscuits is a grim one. The ability to bake fresh bread at sea would be more than a luxury, it would be a miracle, a vital boost to both nutrition and morale. But how do you take your living, bubbling sourdough starter on such a journey? A wet, active starter in a clay pot would spoil or spill in the rough conditions of a ship. It needs a new form. And so, you learn an ancient and ingenious technique for making your starter portable. You take a portion of your healthy, active starter, the one that smells sweet and sour and is full of life. You spread it out in a thin, even layer on a clean wooden board or a piece of linen cloth. Then, you leave it in a warm, dry place, perhaps on a sunny windowsill, or by the gentle heat of a dying fire. Over the course of a day or two, the water evaporates. The bubbling ceases. The living, active paste dries into a brittle, flaky, and completely inert substance. It looks like a thin, pale cracker. The magic seems to have gone, but you know that the magic is not gone, it is merely sleeping. On a microscopic level, the wild yeasts and the friendly lactobacilli that form the starter's living ecosystem have entered a state of suspended animation. Like a seed waiting for the spring rain, they have gone dormant, their life processes slowed to a near standstill, waiting patiently to be reawakened. You break the brittle sheet of dried starter into pieces and place them in a small cloth bag, which you tie securely. This is the sailor's secret weapon. It is lightweight, it takes up almost no space, and it is completely non-perishable. It is a promise of fresh bread, a dormant piece of home that you can carry with you to the far corners of the earth. You pack this precious bag into your small sea chest, alongside your spare shirt, your knife, and perhaps a small Bible. Weeks later, you are at sea. The world has become an endless, shifting landscape of gray water and gray sky. The diet is as grim as you feared. The hardtack is a chore to eat, and the salted meat is a stringy, joyless source of sustenance. The crew is weary, and the mood is glum. The ship's cook decides that it is time for a miracle. From his stores, he retrieves the small cloth bag containing the dried starter. He takes out a few of the hard, flaky pieces and crumbles them into a wooden bowl. He adds a splash of lukewarm water from his ration, and a small spoonful of flour, a quick, sugary meal to welcome the microbes back to the world of the living. He then places the bowl in a warm, sheltered spot near the galley fire, a dangerous place on a wooden ship, but the only place with enough consistent warmth. This galley is a greasy, smoky place, and you might recall the old naval tradition of the slush fund. The cook would collect the foul, leftover fat, or slush, from boiling the salt meat and was allowed to sell it in port for his own profit. For a day, nothing happens. The mixture is just a lifeless paste. But then, on the second day, you see a single, tiny bubble appear on the surface. And then another. Slowly, the dormant ecosystem awakens. The yeasts and bacteria rehydrate and begin to feed and multiply. By the end of the day, the bowl is once again filled with a familiar, gentle, bubbling life. Your starter has crossed the ocean and has come back to life. The cook carefully nurtures this reawakened culture, feeding it with more flour and water until it is strong and active. Then, he bakes. In the cramped, hot, and constantly rocking galley, he kneads a dough and bakes a few rough loaves in his small oven. The smell that wafts out onto the deck of the ship is almost shocking in this world of salt and sea. It is the warm, comforting, and almost forgotten smell of baking bread. You are given a piece of this bread, and as you bite into its soft, airy, tangy crumb, the taste is a powerful connection to the land you left behind. It is a reminder of home, of bakeries, of fields of wheat. You look out at the endless, empty horizon. You have just witnessed the incredible resilience of this living culture you first discovered in an Egyptian pot. It has learned to travel. It has learned to sleep and to reawaken. It has become a sailor's faithful companion, a portable piece of civilization, ready to be carried to the shores of a new world. You stand on the deck of a great sailing ship, a piece of fresh, tangy bread in your hand, a taste of home in the middle of a vast and empty ocean. The living culture you carry, now dried and dormant, has learned to travel. It has crossed the sea, a faithful companion that can be awakened with a little warmth and care. This portable magic, this promise of bread, lands with the sailors and colonists on the shores of a new world, ready to begin a new chapter in its long, strange history. Our journey continues. We leave the age of sail behind, and the narrative moves forward in time, pushing across the new continent. We travel to the late 19th century, an age of industry, expansion, and frenzied hope. The landscape changes once more. The green fields and rolling hills are gone, replaced by towering, snow-capped mountains, dense pine forests, and icy, fast-flowing rivers. You are in the rugged, unforgiving wilderness of the North American frontier, perhaps in the Yukon or the mountains of California. You are here for one reason: gold. You are now a prospector, a gold miner. Your day's a cycle of back-breaking, hope-fueled labor. You spend hours standing in a freezing stream, patiently sifting through sand and gravel with your gold pan. Or you are digging into the hard, frozen earth, the permafrost, with a pickaxe, searching for the elusive glitter of a hidden vein. The work is hard, the rewards are few, and the solitude is immense. In this world, your diet is as harsh and as simple as the landscape itself: beans, bacon, coffee, and whatever bread you can make. And for that, you depend entirely on your most precious possession. It is not your pickaxe, nor your gold pan, nor even the small pouch of gold dust you may have accumulated. Your most important possession is a sturdy earthenware crock, which you guard with your life. Inside this crock lives your sourdough starter. Here on the frontier, the starter is not a hobby, nor a connection to the past. It is a fundamental tool for survival. The men who came here, who endured the brutal winters and the crushing loneliness, became so famously associated with this bubbling pot of life that they earned a nickname, a badge of honor for a seasoned veteran of the North. They were called sourdoughs. The greatest challenge in this new environment is the cold. The wild yeasts and bacteria that make up the living ecosystem in your starter are hardy, but they are not immortal. If the starter is allowed to freeze solid, the delicate microbes will die, and your source of leavening will be gone, a disaster that could mean the difference between life and death in the middle of a long, isolated winter. And so, you learn a new and incredibly intimate way of caring for your living culture. The days are spent in hard labor, but as the sun sets and the temperature plummets far below freezing, you perform a nightly ritual. You bring your precious crock in from the cold. You wrap it carefully in a piece of blanket or a spare bit of flannel. And then, you take it to bed with you. You curl up in your rough bedroll or under your pile of furs, and you tuck the crock in beside you, your own body heat providing the gentle, steady warmth that the microscopic life inside needs to survive the frozen night. The starter becomes your living hot water bottle, a gently burbling companion in the vast, silent, and freezing wilderness. It is a partnership of mutual survival. Your warmth keeps it alive, and its life, in turn, keeps you fed. In the morning, you awaken in the frigid air of your small log cabin. The first thing you do is check on your starter. It is still alive, still bubbling slowly, smelling of that familiar, sharp, yeasty tang. You take a portion of the bubbly starter and mix it with flour and water to create a batter for your breakfast, sourdough flapjacks. You cook them in a heavy, cast iron skillet over your campfire, the hiss of the batter hitting the hot grease a welcome sound in the morning quiet. They are not light and delicate, but they are hot, filling, and nourishing, the perfect fuel for a long day of digging and panning. After your meal, you perform the ancient ritual. You feed your starter, adding a little more flour and water to the crock to replenish what you have used. You then place the crock in the warmest spot you can find, perhaps on a rock near your campfire, to let the culture bubble and grow throughout the day, ready for the evening's meal of biscuits or a rough loaf of bread. The old-timers, the veteran sourdoughs, would tell tall tales about their starters. There were stories of men who fell through the ice into a frozen river and, given the choice, saved their crock of starter before they saved their mining partner. There were stories of starters that were 100 years old, originally brought over from the old country, passed down from one generation of prospectors to the next, a living, bubbling heirloom carrying the spirit of the frontier itself. Historians may debate the romanticism of these stories, but they speak to a fundamental truth. In the immense, crushing loneliness of a prospector's life, the starter became more than just a leavening agent. It was a living thing in a world that often felt dead and frozen. It was a companion. It required care. It responded to attention. It had its own moods and rhythms. Its gentle bubbling was a sound of life, a confirmation that you were not entirely alone. You are curled up now in your bedroll, the fire burned down to glowing embers. Outside, the northern lights might be dancing in the frozen sky, and the only sound is the howl of a distant wolf. It is a vast and lonely world. But tucked in beside you, a small, warm weight against your body, is your crock of sourdough starter, quietly, patiently, and faithfully, bubbling with life. You have seen how this ancient culture has adapted once more, becoming a rugged partner in survival, a symbol of life and perseverance in the most unforgiving of landscapes. You are curled up in your rough bedroll in a frozen cabin, the only warmth coming from your own body and the precious, living crock of sourdough starter tucked in beside you. This hearty, bubbling companion has become a symbol of survival on the unforgiving northern frontier. But frontiers, by their nature, are temporary. The gold rushes, for all their frenzy, eventually fade. The prospectors, the original sourdoughs, pack up their tools and their precious starters and begin to drift back towards civilization. Our journey takes us south now, leaving the icy rivers and pine forests of the Klondike behind. We travel down the coast to a city that was itself born of a gold rush, a chaotic and vibrant boomtown on the edge of the Pacific Ocean. You arrive in San Francisco in the latter half of the 19th century. The air here is not cold and dry, but cool, damp, and heavy with the scent of the sea. The defining feature of this city is not the snow, but the fog, a thick, white blanket that rolls in from the ocean, shrouding the city's famous steep hills in a mysterious, ghostly embrace. The sourdoughs who come down from the mountains bring their starters with them. In this new, bustling city, they transition from miners to merchants, opening bakeries to feed the thousands of new arrivals. Sourdough bread, the food of the frontier, quickly becomes a staple of San Francisco. Famous bakeries are established, like the Bodine Bakery, founded in 1849, which proudly claims to have kept its original mother dough alive ever since, a continuous, living link back to the city's very beginning. But the bakers begin to notice something strange, something wonderful. The bread they bake here in San Francisco, using the very same starters they had nurtured in the mining camps of the Sierra Nevada, tastes different. It is still sourdough, but the flavor is more complex, more pronounced. It has a sharper, tangier, more acidic bite than any bread they have made before. For over a century, the reason for this unique flavor remained a delicious mystery. Bakers would say it was the magic of the San Francisco air, a special quality carried in on the fog. They weren't entirely wrong. You are now standing inside one of these historic bakeries. The air is warm and smells incredible. You watch the bakers, masters of their craft, as they work with their bubbly, active starter. They will tell you that the secret is in the starter, in the mother dough that they have so carefully maintained. But the true secret, the ingredient that makes their bread world famous, is an invisible one, a microscopic inhabitant that has made its home in their starters, a creature that thrives in the city's unique climate. For decades, scientists were puzzled. They knew that all sourdough starters were a symbiotic culture of yeast and bacteria. But what made San Francisco so special? Finally, in the 1970s, a team of microbiologists at the University of California, Davis, solved the mystery. They managed to isolate and identify the specific microbe responsible for that signature tangy flavor. It was a previously unknown species of lactic acid bacteria. In honor of the city where it was discovered and where it reigns supreme, they named it Lactobacillus sanfrancisensis. This unique bacterium had formed a perfect partnership with a specific strain of wild yeast, Candida malari, that was also unusually tolerant of cold temperatures. The cool, foggy climate of the San Francisco Bay Area, which rarely gets very hot or very cold, creates the perfect environment for this microbial power couple to thrive. The yeast does its job, producing the carbon dioxide that makes the bread rise beautifully. But the Lactobacillus sanfrancisensis produces high levels of both lactic acid and, crucially, acetic acid, the acid that gives vinegar its sharp taste. It is this high concentration of acetic acid that gives San Francisco sourdough its famous, assertive, and mouth-puckering tang. This is the ultimate expression of the concept of terroir that we first encountered back in ancient Egypt. Just as the grapes for a fine wine absorb the character of the soil and the climate they are grown in, a sourdough starter absorbs the microbial character of its environment. The starter you have been following on its long journey has adapted once again. It has breathed in the foggy, salty air of the San Francisco Bay, and in doing so, it has become something entirely new. A unique living culture that could not exist anywhere else in the world. Food historians still debate the more subtle influences. Is there such a thing as the baker's thumb? Does the unique microbiome present on a baker's own hands, through years of kneading and handling the dough, contribute its own signature to the starter's flavor profile? It is a romantic idea, a testament to the intimate partnership between the baker and their living dough. You are handed a thick slice of the bread, fresh from the oven. The crust is a deep, golden brown, crackling and blistered. The inside, the crumb, is soft, chewy, and full of beautiful, irregular holes. You take a bite. The flavor is extraordinary. It is rich, complex, and possessed of that famous, sharp, clean sourness that fills your senses. It is the taste of a specific time and a specific place. It is the taste of the gold rush, the taste of the frontier, and the taste of the cool Pacific fog. You look out the bakery window at the mist rolling in over the hills, a great, white, living thing. You now understand the secret ingredient. It is not magic. It is a beautiful accident of microbiology, a perfect convergence of human history, patient craft, and the invisible life carried on the cool, damp sea breeze. You have witnessed the starter reach its most famous and specialized form, a living, breathing, and delicious embodiment of the city it calls home. You are standing in a San Francisco bakery, the cool, foggy air outside a perfect partner to the warm, tangy loaf of bread in your hand. This is the sourdough starter at its most famous, its most specialized, its most celebrated. Here, in this city by the bay, the ancient art of natural leavening has reached a kind of pinnacle, a perfect expression of its environment. But even as this tradition is being perfected, a new and powerful force is rising in the world, a force that will threaten to make your ancient, living starter obsolete. A force born not from accident and tradition, but from science and industry. Our journey takes us forward now, into the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This is the great age of progress, of steam engines, of factories, of the belief that science could solve any problem and improve any process. The world is getting faster. Life is accelerating. And in this new, impatient world, the slow, patient, and sometimes unpredictable art of nurturing a sourdough starter is beginning to look like a relic of a bygone era. Let's be honest, your living starter, for all its magic, can be a demanding companion. It is a living thing, and like all living things, it is temperamental. It needs to be fed every day. It is sensitive to changes in temperature. It can become sluggish and slow, or too acidic and sour. A baker needs years of experience, a kind of sixth sense, to read the moods of their starter and achieve consistent results. And above all, it is slow. The wild yeasts work at their own pace, and the long, slow fermentation required to develop that complex flavor can take the better part of a day. In a world that is beginning to value speed and efficiency above all else, these qualities are starting to be seen not as virtues, but as flaws. Meanwhile, in the laboratories of Europe, a scientific revolution is underway. The great French scientist Louis Pasteur, through his groundbreaking work on fermentation, has demystified the process. He has shown the world that the magic of brewing and baking is not magic at all. It is the work of tiny, living microorganisms. For the first time, people understand that yeast is a single-celled fungus responsible for leavening. And once you understand something, you can begin to control it. Scientists soon learn how to isolate specific, powerful strains of yeast. They discover that one particular species, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the same yeast used to brew beer, is an incredibly efficient and reliable leavener. The next step is to mass produce it. They develop methods to grow these pure strains of yeast on an industrial scale, feeding them on huge vats of nutrient-rich molasses. This living cream of yeast could then be skimmed off, the moisture pressed out, and formed into convenient little blocks or cakes. Later, techniques were developed to dry it into the small, shelf-stable granules we know today. And with that, commercial baker's yeast is born. It arrives on the market as a kind of miracle product. It is convenient, it is cheap, and above all, it is predictable. A baker no longer needs to be a master craftsman with an intuitive feel for his living starter. He no longer needs to feed a bubbling crock day after day. He simply needs to open a packet. The results are the same, every single time. And it is fast. Incredibly fast. A loaf of bread that would have taken all day to rise using a traditional sourdough starter could now be made from start to finish in just a few short hours. For commercial bakeries looking to produce hundreds or thousands of loaves a day, this is a revolutionary advantage. The new yeast also perfectly suited a new ideal of bread that was becoming popular. New milling technologies could now produce a fine, pure white flour, stripped of its bran and germ. And new oven technologies, like the Vienna process which used steam injection, could create loaves with a light, airy texture and a thin, crisp crust. This new, fast-rising commercial yeast was the perfect engine for producing this new kind of soft, white, uniform bread. Food historians and cultural critics still debate the impact of this change. Was it a great democratic achievement, a scientific triumph that made cheap, reliable, and convenient bread accessible to the masses? Or was it a tragic loss, an erosion of nutritional value, flavor diversity, and traditional knowledge in the relentless pursuit of efficiency and profit. From your perspective as the timeless custodian of your starter, the change is heartbreaking. You watch as, over the course of a few decades, the ancient tradition begins to disappear. In bakeries and in homes, the faithful, bubbling sourdough crock is retired. It is placed at the back of a cupboard, forgotten, and eventually thrown away. Its living, complex ecosystem, with its unique terroir and its history stretching back thousands of years, is replaced by a small paper packet of identical, factory-produced, granulated yeast. Bread becomes standardized. It becomes faster, wider, softer, and for the first time in its long history, it becomes bland. The complex, tangy, and soulful flavor that came from the slow work of the lactobacilli is gone, sacrificed for speed and convenience. You have watched your starter survive the fall of empires, cross the world's oceans, and endure the frozen hardships of the frontier. But now, it faces its greatest challenge yet, the quiet, unassuming, and relentless power of scientific progress and industrial convenience. It seems as though the long, slow, magical journey that began by accident in a sun-drenched Egyptian pot is finally coming to an end. The magic has been explained, tamed, and put in a packet. Your starter is not extinct, not yet. But it has gone into a deep hibernation, its ancient, bubbling life carried on only in a few dedicated artisanal bakeries, and in the quiet kitchens of a handful of families who, for reasons of tradition or taste, simply refuse to let the magic die. The world outside has fallen in love with speed and convenience. The soft, uniform, and slightly bland white loaf, made in a few short hours with a packet of commercial yeast, has become the new king. The ancient, slow, and temperamental art of sourdough has been pushed to the margins, a relic of a bygone era. Your bubbling crock, which was once the heart of the Roman bakery and the most precious possession of the Klondike prospector, now seems destined to be forgotten, a casualty of progress. But the story of your starter is not over. It has not died. It has simply gone home. In the quiet corners of the world, far from the bustling commercial bakeries and the new, modern supermarkets, the tradition is kept alive. It survives not as a business, but as a beloved family member. We leave the grand sweep of history for a moment and zoom in on a more intimate scene. You are in a warm, quiet kitchen, perhaps in a rural farmhouse in the European countryside, or in the home of an immigrant family in a bustling American city, sometime in the middle of the 20th century. And you are being passed a sacred trust. From the hands of a grandmother or a great-aunt, you are given a simple glass jar. Inside is a small amount of a familiar, pale, bubbling paste. This is not just any starter, this is the starter. It is the living, breathing legacy of your family. It might even have a name, Bess, or Carl, or the old one, a name given to it generations ago. With the jar comes the oral tradition, the knowledge passed down not in books, but in stories and shared actions. You are shown how to feed it, how to know when it is happy by its sweet, fruity smell, how to read its bubbles like a language. You are taught the feel of the dough it makes, a tactile knowledge that can only be learned by doing. This is the age of the heirloom starter. While the rest of the world embraced the convenience of the factory, these families became the quiet custodians of the living history. They kept their starters alive, not for commercial reasons, but for the sake of tradition, for the superior flavor of the bread, and for the deep, familial connection it represented. You hear the stories associated with your new charge. This starter, your grandmother tells you, was brought over from the old country by her own grandmother, carried across the ocean in a precious crock. It survived a long sea voyage, a new climate, and decades of change. It has been a silent witness to every birth, death, and celebration in your family's history. You learn of other, similar stories. Of pioneers traveling west across the great American plains on the Oregon Trail in the 19th century, their sourdough starters among their most vital provisions. A piece of their old home in Ohio or Missouri could be kept alive and brought with them to their new home in Oregon, a tangible, edible link to the life they had left behind. These family starters often come with their own creation myths. A family in Italy might claim their starter is descended from the very same culture used by the bakers of ancient Pompeii. A family in France might whisper that their levain was a gift from a famous Parisian baker. Folklorists and food historians might debate the literal truth of these claims. Over a century, a starter's microbial makeup will inevitably shift and adapt to its new environment, picking up local yeasts and bacteria. So, is a 150-year-old starter truly the same culture that crossed the plains in a covered wagon? Scientifically, perhaps not. But its story, its lineage, its unbroken chain of care, that is what makes it a genuine heirloom. The starter is not just a collection of microbes, it is the vessel for the family's history and its identity. The ritual of caring for this living legacy becomes a profound act of connection. Once a week, or perhaps every day, you take the jar from its quiet spot. You discard a portion, perhaps giving it to a neighbor who wants to start their own tradition, ensuring the culture spreads and survives, like a cutting from a precious plant. Then you perform the ancient rite of feeding. As you stir in the fresh flour and water, you are not just performing a chore. You are continuing a conversation that stretches back through time. Your hands are performing the same gentle, patient motions as the hands of your great-grandmother, and her mother before her. You are feeding not just a culture of yeast and bacteria, but the very memory of your ancestors. In a world that is becoming increasingly disposable, a world of fast food and throwaway goods, the heirloom starter is a radical and beautiful anomaly. It is a living thing that asks for your patience and your care. It cannot be rushed. It cannot be mass-produced. Its character is a direct reflection of the attention it is given. To keep an heirloom starter alive is to commit to a slow, gentle, and rewarding partnership. You place the freshly fed starter back in its warm spot on the kitchen counter. A few hours later, you see it begin to bubble, a quiet, happy sigh of contentment. You have seen how the starter, pushed into near extinction by the march of industrial progress, found refuge in the most powerful institution of all, the family. It is safe here. It is loved. It is alive, a silent, bubbling storyteller, quietly biding its time in the kitchens of the world, waiting for the day when its slow, ancient magic would be rediscovered. You are in a quiet, mid-century kitchen, the custodian of a living, bubbling heirloom. Your family's sourdough starter, kept safe through generations of turmoil and change, is a quiet testament to the resilience of tradition. While the world outside embraced the speed and uniformity of the factory, your starter has been sleeping, waiting patiently in the quiet corners of the world, its ancient magic known only to a faithful few. But nothing, not even a tradition that is thousands of years old, sleeps forever. Our journey now takes its final step, moving from the recent past into our own time, the late 20th and early 21st centuries. A subtle shift begins to occur in the wider culture. People begin to grow weary of the soft, bland, industrial white loaf. A new craving emerges, a desire for food that is more authentic, more natural, food with a story. A new generation of artisan bakers arises, studying old European techniques and opening small bakeries that reintroduce the public to the complex, tangy, and deeply satisfying flavors of naturally leavened bread. The internet, too, plays a crucial role. The once guarded secrets of sourdough baking are now democratized. A person in a small apartment can watch a video and learn the techniques that were once the domain of master bakers, passed down through years of apprenticeship. The slow, gentle revival of sourdough is happening. But then, in the early 2020s, the world suddenly and dramatically changes. A global pandemic forces humanity into a state of lockdown. People are confined to their homes, their normal routines shattered. They are filled with anxiety and uncertainty, and they have an abundance of one thing they never had before: time. And in this strange new reality of quiet, housebound time, millions of people around the world, as if guided by a collective instinct, turn to the most ancient of comforts. They begin to bake bread. And this is where our story comes full circle. You are no longer just an observer. You are a participant. In your own modern kitchen, you decide to try it for yourself. You will not inherit a starter. You will create one. You will recreate the ancient, accidental magic of the Egyptians. You take a simple glass jar. You mix together two simple ingredients, flour and water. You cover it with a cloth and you leave it on your counter. For a day, nothing happens. For 2 days, nothing happens. You look at the inert, lifeless paste and you feel a sense of doubt. But on the 3rd or 4th day, you see it. A single, tiny bubble appears on the surface. And then another. You lean in and catch a faint, strange, sour smell. It is alive. You have done it. You have captured the wild, invisible yeast and bacteria from the air in your own home, from the flour in your own pantry. You have created life. You become a modern custodian of this ancient tradition. You feed your new starter every day. You give it a name. You watch it grow strong and bubbly, and you feel a deep sense of connection to it. You are participating in the same ritual as the Roman pister, the medieval monk, and the Klondike prospector. But unlike them, you can share your journey with a new, global community. You post pictures of your starter's progress, you ask for advice on baking forums, You share in the collective triumphs and frustrations of thousands of other new bakers who are all on the same journey as you. There are now even starter hotels where you can board your living culture while you go on vacation, a quirky and touching testament to the deep attachment we form with our bubbling companions. After a week or two, your starter is strong enough. You decide to bake your first loaf. You mix the flour, the water, the salt, and your precious, living leaven. You feel the dough in your hands, a soft, supple, living thing. You learn the patient rhythm of stretching and folding. You let it rest, and you watch in amazement as it slowly, beautifully, rises. Finally, you bake it. Your home fills with the most incredible smell, the warm, comforting, and intoxicating aroma of baking bread. When you take the loaf from the oven, it is a masterpiece. Its crust is a deep, burnished brown, covered in beautiful cracks and blisters. As it cools, you can hear it sing, a tiny, crackling sound as the crust contracts. You cut the first slice. The inside is a beautiful, creamy web of irregular holes, the testament to the slow, happy work of your wild yeast. You take a bite. The flavor is complex, tangy, and delicious. And it is a flavor that you, and the invisible life in your home, created together. Sociologists will debate whether this sourdough revival was a temporary fad born of circumstance, or if it represents a more permanent shift in our relationship with food. But for you, it feels profound. You look at the loaf of bread you have just made. You have followed this living culture from its accidental birth on the banks of the Nile, through the great empires and dark ages, across oceans and frozen frontiers, through its near extinction at the hands of industry, and through its quiet preservation in the heart of the family. And now, at the end of its long journey, it has found a new home, right here, in your own kitchen. The starter is not just alive, it is thriving, more widespread and more loved than perhaps ever before. The ancient magic is yours now. The journey is complete. You have unraveled the long, slow, and gentle history of this most remarkable of human creations. The story of the starter is a story of patience, of resilience, of the beautiful and complex partnership between our own human ingenuity and the invisible, magical world of microbes. It is a story of how a simple thing, a bubbling pot of flour and water, can become a living link to our shared past, a comforting, nourishing, and tangible piece of history. Now, with the story told, let the feeling of warmth and contentment fill your mind. Let the memory of that beautiful, fresh-baked loaf be a final, comforting thought. The work is all done. The bread has risen, and all that is left to do is rest. Allow yourself to sink deeply into the softness of your bed, to feel the gentle weight of your blankets, and to drift away into a peaceful, nourishing, and well-earned sleep. Hey guys, tonight we are taking a trip back to a decade of immense contradiction. We're heading to the Roaring '20s in America, a time of jazz music, flapper dresses, and dazzling Art Deco skylines. But beneath this glittering surface of modernity and excess, the country was engaged in a strange and fascinating social experiment. Imagine a world where you can see the first real moving pictures, hear the first radio broadcasts, and watch cities explode upwards with new skyscrapers. But you can't legally buy a simple glass of beer. Frankly, if you wanted a cocktail after work, your journey would involve secret passwords, criminal gangs, and booze that could potentially blind you. Your quiet nightcap could literally be the last thing you ever drink. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Go ahead and post your location and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your journey begins on a cold and busy night. It is January 16, 1920. You are in a bustling saloon in a great American city like Chicago or New York. The air is thick with cigar smoke and the smell of stale beer, but also with a strange, frantic energy. The room is packed. People are ordering 2, 3, even 4 drinks at a time, lining them up on the bar. In a corner, a group is holding a mock funeral, complete with a small coffin, for a figure they called John Barleycorn, the traditional English personification of alcohol. There is a mood of wild, last-minute celebration, but underneath it all, there is a deep and profound sense of melancholy. It feels like New Year's Eve, but instead of counting down to a new year, everyone is counting down to the end of an era. At midnight, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution will officially go into effect. At 12:01 a.m., this entire establishment, and every other saloon, bar, and brewery in the country, will become illegal. This drastic measure did not come out of nowhere. This is a mainstream historical fact that is crucial to understand. National prohibition was the result of a century of tireless activism. The temperance movement, led by powerful and highly organized groups like the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, had successfully framed alcohol as the root of all of society's problems. In their view, the saloon was not a place of harmless socializing, it was the breeding ground for poverty, crime, political corruption, and, most devastatingly, domestic violence. They argued, with great passion, that banning alcohol was a progressive social reform, a way to protect families, improve public health, and create a more moral and efficient nation. They had finally won the argument. The law itself came in two parts. First was the 18th Amendment, which banned the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors. Second was the Volstead Act, the federal law passed to enforce the amendment. The Volstead Act was the law that defined exactly what an intoxicating liquor was, and it set the limit at a punishingly low 0.5% alcohol by volume. Your average beer has about 5%. This meant that nearly every alcoholic beverage was now, by definition, illegal. But this leads us to our first quirky tidbit of the era, one that reveals the deep class divisions in the law from the very beginning. The Volstead Act banned the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol. But it did not ban the private possession or consumption of alcohol that you already owned before the law went into effect. In the months leading up to January 1920, the wealthy had seen the writing on the wall. They bought out the inventories of entire liquor stores. They commissioned massive wine cellars to be built in their mansions. The writer F. Scott Fitzgerald noted that his wealthy friends had stockpiled enough liquor to last them for years. So, on this last night of legal drinking, while you and the working-class patrons of this saloon are having your last rites, the rich are simply stocking their shelves for a decade-long private party. This detail also fuels a long-running scholarly debate about the true motivations behind the Prohibition movement. Was it, as its supporters claimed, a genuinely progressive, often female-led, social reform movement aimed at protecting the family and curbing the excesses of a nation of heavy drinkers? Or, as other historians argue, was it also deeply rooted in a nativist, anti-immigrant sentiment? Was it a way for the mostly rural, Protestant, old-stock Americans to control the culture and behavior of the millions of new Catholic and Jewish immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Poland, and Eastern Europe, who crowded the saloons of the great industrial cities? The truth, as is often the case, is likely a complex and uncomfortable mixture of both. Back in the saloon, the clock on the wall is ticking relentlessly towards midnight. The bartender, a man who will be unemployed in a few minutes, makes the last call in the history of his establishment. A final, collective groan goes up from the crowd. You savor the last few sips of your beer. At precisely midnight, the bartender ceremoniously pulls the taps for the last time. The party is over. You and the other patrons file out onto the cold street. The doors of the saloon are locked behind you. All up and down the street, the lights of other saloons are going out, one by one. A strange and unfamiliar quiet begins to settle over the city's nightlife. The noble experiment, as it was called, has officially begun. The intention was to heal the nation's social ills. But as you stand on the dark sidewalk, looking at the now illegal saloon, you have a feeling it is about to create a whole new set of problems. And you are faced with a very simple, very pressing question: where on earth are you going to get a drink tomorrow? The great American drought has begun. The saloon doors are locked, the breweries are silent, and a strange new quiet has settled over the nation's social life. The intention of the 18th Amendment was to create a wall, completely sealing the country off from the evils of alcohol. But the architects of that wall, in their legislative wisdom, left a few small, but crucial, cracks in the foundation. And for you, a citizen in a newly and uncomfortably dry nation, your first survival tactic is to learn how to exploit them. Your first destination is not a shady back alley, but a respectable doctor's office. A few weeks or months into Prohibition, you find yourself feeling unwell. You're not sleeping well. You have a general sense of malaise, a touch of anxiety, a grip that you just can't seem to shake. It's nothing specific, just a feeling that the stresses of modern life are getting to be too much for your delicate constitution. You decide that what you need is not just rest, you need a tonic, a restorative to bolster your spirits. You need medical attention. You make your way to your local physician's office. You notice immediately that his waiting room is much fuller than it used to be, filled with other men and women who all seem to be suffering from a similar, vague sort of fatigue. When it's your turn, you sit before the doctor, a man with a tired but knowing look in his eyes. He asks you to describe your symptoms. You tell him about your restlessness, your anxiety, the general feeling of being run down. You explain that you just don't feel like yourself lately. The doctor listens with a grave, serious expression, perhaps nodding sympathetically. He might check your pulse. He might listen to your heart. After a moment of thoughtful contemplation, he concurs. Your condition is indeed concerning, and it requires a potent, time-tested remedy to restore your vigor. He then opens a drawer in his desk and pulls out a special, government-issued prescription pad. This is Form 1403, and it is your golden ticket. With a flourish of his fountain pen, he writes you a prescription. It is not for a pill or a tablet. It is for 1 pint of spiritus frumenti, the official, Latin term for whiskey. The prescription might note that it is to be taken in doses of 1 tablespoon every few hours, to combat malaise. This is the mainstream historical fact that represents the single biggest loophole in the Volstead Act. The law, while banning recreational alcohol, made a specific exception for medicinal liquor. And almost overnight, the American medical community rose to the occasion, diagnosing a wide variety of ailments for which the only effective cure, it seemed, was a pint of aged bourbon or brandy. You take your precious slip of paper and walk down the street to the local pharmacy. The pharmacy, once a place for tonics and sodas, now has the air of a secretive, but legal, dispensary. You hand your prescription to the pharmacist. He gives it a cursory glance, stamps it, and then disappears into a back room. He returns not with a small bottle of pills, but with a pint bottle of whiskey, perhaps from a well-known brand like Old Grandad or Shenley. The bottle is sealed and often has an official-looking label wrapped around it, proclaiming, "For medicinal purposes only." You have just successfully, and completely legally, purchased a bottle of whiskey in the heart of Prohibition America. The scale of this loophole was truly staggering. The number of physicians who registered for the special prescription pads, and the number of pharmacists who applied for licenses to dispense liquor, skyrocketed. In the first year of Prohibition alone, doctors wrote millions of prescriptions for alcoholic spirits. Great American distilleries, which should have gone out of business, were granted federal licenses to continue producing their whiskey to supply this booming medical market. And this leads us to a quirky and amusing tidbit: the sheer range of ailments for which whiskey was prescribed. It was recommended by physicians as a cure for everything from depression, anxiety, and insomnia to indigestion, heart problems, high blood pressure, and even cancer. It was, in effect, the go-to cure-all for any complaint a patient might have, a veritable snake oil now sanctioned by the federal government and prescribed by licensed doctors. This nationwide phenomenon raises a fascinating scholarly debate about the motivations of the thousands of doctors who participated. Were they acting out of a genuine, if archaic, medical belief in the healing properties of alcohol? After all, for centuries, spirits had been used as a tonic and a restorative. Or were they simply cynical businessmen, taking advantage of a flawed law to do a roaring trade in $10 prescriptions? Or, a third possibility, were many of them acting out of a quiet sense of civil disobedience, believing the law to be a foolish and intrusive overreach, and seeing it as their duty to help their patients circumvent it with a knowing wink and a nod? The truth is likely a mixture of all three. There were, of course, limitations. The law stipulated that a person could only be prescribed 1 pint of spirits every 10 days. So, while it was a reliable and legal source of alcohol, it was not nearly enough to satisfy a dedicated drinker or to supply a party. It was a crack in the wall of prohibition, but it was not a hole big enough for the nation's full thirst to pass through. You walk out of the pharmacy, the bottle of medicine safely tucked away. You have learned your first, crucial lesson in surviving this new, dry era. The law may be the law, but human ingenuity is eternal. You have discovered that while the government has closed the saloons, it has inadvertently turned every doctor's office into a confessional of vague symptoms, and every pharmacy into a high-end, government-approved liquor store. The noble experiment has barely begun, and already, it is beginning to look like a national farce. Your legally acquired, medicinal pint of whiskey provides a certain amount of comfort, but it is a quiet and lonely comfort. What you miss is the atmosphere of the old saloon, the music, the chatter, the feeling of being part of a crowd. The government has made that illegal, but you are beginning to learn that in this new era, there is a difference between what is legal and what is available. For a real drink, for a real night out, you need to leave the world of prescriptions and pharmacies behind. You need to go underground. You need to find a speakeasy. You can't find one by looking in a directory or asking for directions. The locations of these illegal drinking dens were a closely guarded secret, constantly changing to stay one step ahead of the law. Finding one required a connection. You might get a tip from a friend, a scribbled address on a napkin. A taxi driver might discreetly hand you a business card for what appears to be a tailor shop, but with a knowing look in his eye. The first step to surviving prohibition is learning how to navigate this new, secret, word-of-mouth network. Following a whispered tip, you find yourself on a quiet, respectable-looking street. You arrive at the address you were given. It appears to be a small, unassuming flower shop. The lights are off, and there is a closed sign in the window. There is no sound, no sign of life. For a moment, you think you have been fooled. But you were given instructions. You walk down the adjacent alleyway and find a single, plain, unmarked door. This is it. You knock, perhaps a specific rhythm you were told to use. For a long moment, nothing happens. Then, a small slot in the door at eye level slides open with a dry, scraping sound. A pair of suspicious eyes peer out at you. A gruff voice from behind the door asks, "Who sent you?" or demands a password. "Gus sent me," you might reply, your heart pounding a little. Or you might give the password of the week, something absurd like "the eagle flies at midnight." This ritual of the peephole and the password is the mainstream historical fact of speakeasy culture, a small piece of theater that separated the legitimate from the illegitimate, the outsider from the insider. The eyes look you over one more time. Then you hear the satisfying thud of a heavy bolt being drawn back. The door creaks open just enough for you to slip inside, and it is immediately closed and bolted behind you. The contrast is staggering. You have stepped from a silent, dark alleyway into a different universe. The air is hot, thick with cigarette smoke, and buzzing with energy. A jazz band is playing loud and fast in the corner. The room is packed with people talking, laughing, and dancing on a tiny, crowded dance floor. You have found it. You notice something else that is revolutionary for the time. Men and women are mingling freely, drinking together at the same tables. Before Prohibition, the saloon was almost exclusively a male domain. The speakeasy, by its very nature as a secret, anything-goes kind of place, broke down these old social barriers. It was here that the flapper culture of the Roaring Twenties was born, a world of short skirts, short hair, and new, modern social freedoms. You make your way to the bar. You can't just order a whiskey. You might order a cup of coffee or a pot of tea, which is code. The bartender will then serve you your illegal liquor in a teacup or a coffee mug, a flimsy disguise in case of a police raid. And the liquor itself is often of a questionable quality. Harsh, homemade gin and poorly distilled bootleg whiskey were the norm. This leads us to a quirky and delicious historical tidbit, the golden age of the cocktail. The skilled bartenders of the speakeasy era became expert mixologists out of necessity. They invented countless new and complex cocktails, like the bee's knees, with lemon juice and honey, or the sidecar, with orange liqueur and lemon juice, specifically to mask the foul, chemical taste of the raw, bootleg alcohol. The cocktail wasn't just a fancy drink, it was a form of camouflage for bad booze. The very existence of these places, which flourished in every city, raises a scholarly debate about their true social impact. Were speakeasies genuinely democratizing spaces, as the myth suggests? Were they places where different social classes, races, and genders could finally mingle in ways that were impossible in the more rigid, pre-prohibition world? Or was this social mixing largely a romantic myth, with most speakeasies remaining segregated by class and race, catering primarily to a wealthy, white, urban clientele who were treating the law as a fashionable game? As you sit, sipping your cocktail from a teacup and listening to the jazz band, you feel the thrill of the illicit. You are breaking the law, and so is everyone else in this crowded, smoky room. There is a constant, low-level hum of danger beneath the music and the laughter. Everyone has a plan for what to do if they hear the 3 sharp whistles that signal a police raid. But the danger is part of the appeal. It makes the drinks taste better. The music sounds sweeter. You now understand that the speakeasy was much more than just an illegal bar. It was the defiant heart of the Roaring Twenties. It was a cultural laboratory where new music, new fashions, and new social rules were being invented every night. You have successfully navigated the secret geography of your city and passed the test at the door. You are now part of the great, open secret of Prohibition America. You are sitting in the warm, smoky haze of the speakeasy, the sound of the jazz band washing over you. You take a sip of your cocktail. The gin is harsh, but the lemon and honey do their best to mask it. And as you look at the glass in your hand, a simple question forms in your mind. Where did this actually come from? The great distilleries and breweries are all officially closed. The legal supply of medicinal whiskey is just a tiny trickle. So how is this bar, and thousands like it across the country, stocked with liquor every single night? The answer takes you out of the glamorous city club and into the dangerous, sprawling, and highly profitable world of the bootlegger's supply chain. The illegal alcohol that filled your glass came from one of two main sources. It was either secretly made here, in America, or it was smuggled in from abroad. Let's first travel to its domestic source. The scene shifts from the roaring city to the deep, quiet, and isolated hollows of the Appalachian Mountains. Here, hidden from the main roads, under the cover of thick forest, a different kind of craftsman is at work. You see a ramshackle shelter built over a stream. The air is thick with the sweet, heavy smell of fermenting corn mash. This is the domain of the moonshiner. For generations, people in these hills have been turning their surplus corn into high-proof whiskey, and Prohibition has just turned their small-scale folk tradition into a booming, if highly illegal, industry. You see the still itself, a beautiful, if crude, contraption of copper pots and tubing, with a fire burning steadily beneath it. You watch as the clear, fiery liquid, the UN-aged corn whiskey known as White Lightning or Moonshine, drips steadily from the end of a copper coil into a clay jug. This is dangerous work. The threat is not just from the risk of the still itself exploding, but from the constant fear of federal revenue agents, the revenuers who hunt for the telltale signs of smoke in these hills. But while moonshine supplied a significant part of the market, especially in rural areas, the real volume, the liquor that supplied the great city speakeasies, came from overseas. This brings us to the second, and much larger, part of the supply chain, the rum runners. This is the mainstream historical fact that defined the era's smuggling operations. Imagine you are on a small, dark boat in the middle of the night, a few miles off the coast of New Jersey or Long Island. The sea is choppy. In the distance, you see a line of dark shapes on the horizon, each showing a faint light. This is Rum Row. It is a massive, floating liquor store, a fleet of large cargo ships that have sailed from Canada, the Caribbean, and Europe, laden with crates of Canadian whiskey, Caribbean rum, and French champagne. They anchored just outside the U.S. maritime limit, at first 3 miles, and later extended to 12, in international waters, where the U.S. Coast Guard has no jurisdiction. They simply wait for their customers. And you are one of those customers. Your boat is a contact boat, a small, light, and incredibly fast vessel, its engine specially modified for speed. You pull alongside one of the great motherships, a tense transaction takes place over the water, and your boat is loaded with as many crates of illicit booze as it can carry. Now comes the most dangerous part, the high-speed run back to shore. You are racing against the dawn and against the patrol boats of the Coast Guard, who are waiting just inside the maritime limit. It's a terrifying, exhilarating chase through the dark waves. Your destination is a hidden cove, a quiet beach, or a fog-shrouded dock where a truck is waiting to quickly unload your precious cargo before you disappear back into the night. The men who did this work are legends. The most famous was Captain Bill McCoy, a former boat builder who became one of the most successful rum runners on the East Coast. He was known for selling only high-quality, unadulterated liquor, never watering it down. His product was so reliable that people began referring to it as the real McCoy, a phrase that has entered the language as a term for something authentic and of high quality. This brings us to a quirky tidbit of the era, the sheer ingenuity of the smugglers. To avoid capture, they developed all sorts of clever concealment methods. Trucks were fitted with false floors and hidden compartments. Some rum runners even developed submersible torpedo-like devices that could be filled with liquor and towed secretly underwater behind their boats, invisible to the patrols on the surface. This entire vast, criminal enterprise leads to a scholarly debate. What was the true structure of the bootlegging economy? Was it, as popular culture often suggests, controlled entirely by a few large, powerful, and violent criminal syndicates like Al Capone's in Chicago? Or was it, as many historians now argue, a much more decentralized and diverse black market, made up of thousands of smaller, independent operators, the family of moonshiners in Tennessee, the small boat owner on the coast, the guy driving a modified Ford across the frozen Detroit River from Canada in the dead of winter? The answer is likely that it was a complex ecosystem of both. You are back in your comfortable seat in the speakeasy. You look at your glass with a new sense of awe. The gin in your cocktail might have been distilled last week in a hidden back room just a few blocks away. The whiskey in your friend's glass, however, may have had a much grander journey. It might have been distilled in Scotland, sailed across the Atlantic, transferred to a rum runner's speedboat on Rum Row, landed on a moonless beach in New Jersey, driven to a secret warehouse in the city, and finally, delivered to the back door of this very establishment. Your simple drink is the end point of a massive, dangerous, and incredibly complex international supply chain, all created from scratch to defy a single, unpopular law. You are sitting in the speakeasy, the jazz music playing, the illegal cocktail cool in your hand. You now understand the vast, shadowy, and dangerous supply chain that brought this drink to you, the hidden stills of the moonshiners, the high-speed boats of the rum runners. But as you lift the glass to your lips, you must confront the final and most personal danger of all. It's not about getting caught by the police. It's about the contents of the glass itself. In an unregulated black market, how do you know what you're drinking is safe? The truth is, you don't. The smuggled liquor, the whiskey and rum supplied by respected bootleggers like Bill McCoy, the real McCoy was generally safe and of high quality, but it was also very expensive. The much cheaper alcohol, the kind that supplied the thousands of less reputable speakeasies and backroom joints, was a far more dangerous gamble. This was the world of homemade hooch, and its most famous product was bathtub gin. Now, the term bathtub gin is a little misleading. It rarely involved making gin in an actual bathtub. The name became a catch-all term for any kind of amateurishly produced, homemade spirits. The most common method was to take raw, industrial-grade grain alcohol, which was harsh and undrinkable on its own, and transform it into gin. This was done by mixing it with water and adding a few key ingredients to give it its characteristic flavor, juniper oil for the piney taste, and perhaps a little glycerin to give it a smoother, oilier mouthfeel. It was a crude, simple process that could be done in any back room or kitchen. But where did the bootleggers get this raw industrial alcohol? This is where the story takes a dark and dangerous turn, and where we find the mainstream historical fact that explains why Prohibition-era booze could be so deadly. Alcohol is a vital component in countless industrial processes. It's used to make perfumes, antifreeze, paint, varnish, and fuel. The government couldn't ban industrial alcohol entirely. So, to prevent people from drinking it, the law required manufacturers to denature it. This meant they had to add poisonous chemicals to make it unpotable. The primary poison used was methyl alcohol, also known as methanol or wood alcohol. It's chemically similar to the ethanol we drink, but it is metabolized very differently by the human body. Bootleggers would obtain huge quantities of this poisoned industrial alcohol, often by bribing factory workers or hijacking shipments. They would then attempt to renature it, using crude chemical processes to try and remove the methanol and other poisons. The problem is, they were often terrible chemists, and their methods were almost always unsuccessful. This meant that a huge percentage of the cheap liquor being sold across the country was tainted with a deadly poison, put there by the government itself. When a person drinks methanol, the consequences are horrific. The poison specifically attacks the central nervous system and, most famously, the optic nerve. The first symptoms are dizziness and nausea, but they are soon followed by blurred vision, and then, often, complete and irreversible blindness. In larger doses, methanol causes organ failure, paralysis, and a painful, agonizing death. It is estimated that during Prohibition, at least 10,000 people were killed by drinking this tainted alcohol, and many, many more were left permanently blind or paralyzed. This widespread poisoning gave rise to its own quirky and tragic slang. A common affliction was a type of paralysis caused by a contaminated brand of Jamaican ginger extract, which was sold as a medicinal product. The condition, which caused people to walk with a strange, high-stepping gait, became known as the ginger jake, or simply jake-like. A tainted cocktail was sometimes called a bum drink, and the poisonous wood alcohol itself was often referred to grimly as the smoke. This leads to a deeply troubling scholarly debate about the ethics of the government's own actions. The federal government was fully aware that bootleggers were using denatured alcohol and that people were dying from it. In fact, as the problem grew, some officials in the Treasury Department ordered manufacturers to add even more, and even deadlier, poisons to the industrial supply, hoping to scare people into sobriety. Was this, as the government claimed, a legitimate, if harsh, law enforcement strategy designed to uphold the 18th Amendment? Or was it, as its critics argued then and now, a shockingly cynical and cruel policy, a form of chemical warfare waged against its own citizens, where the government was knowingly and directly responsible for the deaths and blinding of thousands of its own people? You look down at the cocktail in your hand with a new sense of profound unease. Every time you ordered a drink in a speakeasy, You were playing a game of Russian roulette. You had to place your complete trust in the man who ran the bar, and in the bootlegger who supplied him. A new, cheaper supplier, a misstep in the renaturing process, and your next sip could be your last. The noble experiment, designed to protect the nation from the health problems of alcoholism, had ironically made the simple act of having a drink one of the most dangerous and potentially fatal things a person could do. Your survival in this era now depends not just on avoiding the law, but on the terrifying gamble of avoiding the liquor itself. You swirl the suspect cocktail in your teacup, the fear of methanol poisoning making you hesitate. You would gladly pay a higher price for a drink if you could be certain it was safe. You, and millions of others, are craving a product that is not just available, but reliable. You are craving quality control. And in this new, illicit marketplace, this demand for a dependable and safe supply of alcohol created the single greatest business opportunity in the history of the American underworld. The noble experiment is about to give rise to the golden age of the American gangster. Before 1920, organized crime in America certainly existed, but it was a relatively small-scale and fragmented affair. There were neighborhood street gangs, primarily involved in gambling, theft, and prostitution. But Prohibition changed the game completely. Overnight, the government had outlawed a product that tens of millions of people still desperately wanted. They had created a nationwide, billion-dollar black market, and the only people equipped to service that market were those who were already comfortable operating outside the law. Bootlegging was a far more complex business than running a neighborhood gambling den. It required a level of organization that transformed these small street gangs into sophisticated criminal corporations. First, you needed to control the supply, either by operating your own network of hidden stills and breweries, or by managing the importation of liquor from Canada or the Caribbean. Second, you needed logistics, a fleet of fast cars and powerful trucks, and a small army of drivers to move the product. Third, you needed warehousing, secure locations to store thousands of crates of booze. Fourth, you needed a distribution network to deliver the product to hundreds, or even thousands, of speakeasies. And finally, you needed enforcement, a private army of gunmen to protect your shipments from rival gangs and to convince speakeasy owners to buy your product and pay for your protection. No figure better illustrates this transformation from thug to CEO than the most famous gangster of all time, Al Capone. This is a mainstream historical fact that is impossible to ignore. Capone built a criminal empire in Chicago that was run with the ruthless efficiency of a Fortune 500 company. His organization controlled the flow of high-quality Canadian whiskey, running it down through a network of highways to Chicago. He owned breweries that operated in plain sight, protected by the bribes he paid to police and politicians. He forced nearly every speakeasy in the city to buy his liquor at his prices. At the height of his power, it is estimated his empire was grossing over $100 million a year, an almost unimaginable sum in the 1920s. Of course, this business was enforced not with contracts, but with violence. The competition between rival gangs for control of the lucrative bootlegging territories was brutally violent. This culminated in the most infamous gangland killing in American history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929. Capone's men, disguised as police officers, entered a warehouse used by the rival North Side gang. They lined 7 of their opponents up against a wall and executed them with machine guns. It was a cold, calculated, corporate-style hit, designed to eliminate the competition. This leads to a quirky and important tidbit about the broader structure of organized crime in this era. While Capone was consolidating his power in Chicago with violence, gangsters in New York were learning a different lesson. Ambitious young criminals like Charles Lucky Luciano, an Italian, and his close associate Meyer Lansky, who was Jewish, realized that the old ethnic rivalries were bad for business. There was more than enough money to go around. They helped to forge a new kind of criminal organization, a national crime syndicate, where the leaders of the various Italian, Jewish, and Irish mobs would cooperate. They formed a board of directors, sometimes called the Commission, to mediate disputes, set territories, and maximize profits for everyone. Prohibition, in a strange way, was the great unifier of the American mafia, forcing old neighborhood rivals to think like modern corporate executives. The spectacular rise of these gangster empires, with their immense wealth and their shocking public violence, leads to a scholarly debate about the era's lasting impact. Did Prohibition and the rise of the celebrity gangster permanently glamorize the figure of the outlaw in American culture? And did the widespread, open corruption of police, judges, and politicians with mob money create a deep and lasting cynicism towards the rule of law itself? A feeling that the whole system was rigged? Many historians argue that the damage done to public trust during this era was one of Prohibition's most destructive legacies. You're back in your seat at the speakeasy. You now understand the invisible architecture that makes this secret world possible. The reason the jazz band can play, the reason the bartender can operate without fear, and the reason the gin in your glass is probably, hopefully, safe to drink, is because the owner of this establishment pays a weekly tribute to a powerful crime syndicate. The booze is supplied by their trucks, and the police are kept away by their bribes. You look around the room at the laughing, dancing crowd. They are all, in their own small way, contributing to the immense power of men like Al Capone. You now understand that the noble experiment did not end the liquor business. It simply performed a hostile takeover, transferring the industry from legal, tax-paying brewers and distillers, to a new, fabulously wealthy, and ruthlessly violent class of criminal entrepreneurs. You are immersed in the world of the bootlegger. The criminal empires built by men like Al Capone seem all-powerful, their control over the nation's illegal liquor supply absolute, their power enforced by bribery and bloodshed. But the United States government, having passed this noble experiment into law, did not simply stand by and watch it fail. It declared war. And you will now see this long and frustrating conflict from the perspective of the soldiers on the front lines, the federal prohibition agents. To enforce the Volstead Act, the government created a new federal agency, the Bureau of Prohibition. From the very beginning, it was a troubled organization. It was housed within the Treasury Department. It was chronically underfunded, and it was tasked with policing the behavior of an entire nation of thirsty citizens. The agents themselves, nicknamed PROs, were a mixed bag. The job was dangerous and the pay was low, which made them incredibly susceptible to the massive bribes offered by the wealthy bootlegging syndicates. Corruption was rampant, but not all the agents were corrupt. Many were genuinely idealistic, true believers in the cause of temperance who saw themselves as moral crusaders. Others were simply dedicated lawmen, drawn to the thrill and the challenge of taking on the country's most powerful new criminal empires. Theirs was a thankless and incredibly dangerous job. Imagine a day in the life of a prohibition agent. It might begin with a raid on a suspected speakeasy. You and your fellow agents, armed with pistols and heavy axes, would smash through the hidden door, sending the patrons scattering. You would then set about the grim work of destruction, using your axes to shatter barrels of beer, to smash crate after crate of whiskey bottles, the sharp, pungent smell of the illegal liquor filling the air as it gurgled into the gutters. Another day might find you engaged in a high-speed chase on a lonely country road at night, your unarmored government car trying to keep up with a bootlegger's modified Cadillac, its suspension beefed up to handle the weight of hundreds of gallons of moonshine. These chases often ended in shootouts, with both sides armed and willing to use deadly force. Or you might be trekking deep into the Appalachian Hills, following a tip to find and destroy a hidden moonshine still, facing the resentment and potential violence of the local community who saw you as an invader. This constant battle created some legendary figures. This brings us to a quirky and entertaining tidbit from the annals of law enforcement, the story of Izzy Einstein and Mo Smith. They were two of the most famous and successful prohibition agents in New York City, not because they were tough gunslingers, but because they were masters of disguise and theatricality. They would pose as anything to gain entry to a speakeasy, as German opera singers, Texas cattlemen, gravediggers, or even as a couple on a date. Once inside, they would order a drink, and as soon as it was served, they would dramatically reveal their badges and declare the establishment under arrest. They made nearly 5,000 arrests in just a few years, using humor and cleverness as their primary weapons. But the most famous agent of all, the man whose name became synonymous with the fight against the mob, was Eliot Ness. This is the mainstream historical fact of prohibition enforcement. In Chicago, Ness was tasked with leading a small, hand-picked team of agents to take on Al Capone's massive empire. Ness and his men knew they couldn't arrest every bootlegger or raid every speakeasy. Instead, they focused on disrupting Capone's business, targeting his largest, most profitable illegal breweries and distilleries, costing him millions of dollars in lost product. They became famous for their bravery and, most importantly, for their incorruptibility. Capone's syndicate tried to bribe them, offering them huge sums of money to look the other way. Ness and his team publicly refused the bribes, earning them the famous nickname given to them by the press, the Untouchables. The story of Ness and his Untouchables, a small band of heroes taking on the country's most powerful gangster, is a powerful one, immortalized in television and movies. The reality, however, was a bit more complicated. While Ness and his team were a genuine nuisance to Capone, they were not the ones who ultimately brought him down. The man who defeated Al Capone was not a gunslinger, but an accountant. It was the quiet, meticulous work of financial investigators from the Treasury Department that convicted Capone not of murder or bootlegging, but of federal income tax evasion, finally sending him to prison. This all leads to the great scholarly debate about prohibition enforcement. Was it a complete and total failure? After all, anyone who wanted a drink during Prohibition could almost always find one. The law was flouted on a massive scale. Or, as some revisionist historians argue, did the enforcement, for all its flaws and corruption, actually succeed in some of its goals? They point to statistics that show a significant decline in overall alcohol consumption during the 1920s, especially among the working class who could not afford the high prices of illegal booze. In this view, Prohibition, while a failure in many ways, may have had some positive public health outcomes. You now see the other side of the Roaring Twenties nightlife. For every glamorous speakeasy, there was the constant threat of an axe crashing through the door. For every wealthy gangster, there was a dedicated, if often outgunned, federal agent trying to dismantle his empire. You understand now that Prohibition was not just a law, it was a war. It was a long, bloody, and frustrating war, fought by a handful of agents against a vast criminal conspiracy, an enormous public demand, and a deep-seated culture of corruption. They were trying to enforce an unenforceable law, a noble and impossible experiment. You have now seen the dark underbelly of the noble experiment. You have witnessed the grim war between the bootleggers and the federal agents, a conflict fought with machine guns, back alley bribes, and poison liquor. It is a story of crime, corruption, and violence. But history is full of strange ironies. And the greatest irony of Prohibition is that this repressive, conservative law, intended to enforce a strict moral code on the nation, ended up accidentally fueling one of the most explosive and liberating cultural revolutions in American history. To see it, you just have to step back inside the speakeasy. Before Prohibition, the American saloon was a spit and sawdust kind of place. It was overwhelmingly male, it was often tied to local political machines, and it was not considered a respectable place for women to be seen. By making the saloon illegal, the 18th Amendment didn't just ban drinking, it destroyed an entire social institution. And in its place, a new, secret, and very different kind of institution grew, the speakeasy. And this secret club became a laboratory for a new kind of American culture. The most visible symbol of this cultural shift was the new woman, the icon of the decade, the flapper. This is a mainstream historical fact that is impossible to separate from the era. Before the war, a respectable woman wore her hair long and her hemlines longer. After the war, and in the smoky, liberated atmosphere of the speakeasy, a new ideal emerged. You see her on the dance floor. Her hair is cut into a short, daring bob. Her dress is loose and straight, the hemline shockingly raised to just below the knee, designed to kick and fly as she dances. She wears makeup, she smokes cigarettes in public from a long holder, and she sips a cocktail from a teacup, meeting men's gazes with a confidence that would have been scandalous just a decade earlier. The flapper was a declaration of independence, and the speakeasy was her natural habitat. And what was she dancing to? The speakeasies, run by gangsters who wanted to keep their customers drinking and happy, needed entertainment. And the sound that filled these illegal clubs was a new, energetic, and uniquely American music that had migrated up from the black communities of New Orleans, jazz. You hear the syncopated rhythms of the piano, the wail of a trumpet, the improvisational genius of a clarinet solo. It was a music that was vibrant, modern, and slightly dangerous, the perfect soundtrack for an illegal night out. And with the new music came new dances, like the wild, kicking, frenetic Charleston, a dance that would have given the upright members of the temperance movement a collective heart attack. The speakeasy also fundamentally changed the rules of dating and socializing. For the first time, young, unmarried men and women were mixing and drinking together in a semi-public setting. This was a radical social shift. The speakeasy became the primary destination for a date, a place where a young couple could escape the watchful eyes of their parents and enjoy a new, modern kind of courtship, fueled by jazz music and illegal cocktails. This new culture of home entertainment leads us to a quirky and enduring tidbit. With public bars closed, people who wanted to socialize had to do so in their own homes. This gave rise to a new social ritual, the cocktail party. Before Prohibition, people drank straight whiskey or beer. But now, with the available liquor often being harsh, homemade bathtub gin, hosts needed a way to make it more palatable. They began to mix the raw spirits with fruit juices, sodas, and other flavorings, and serve them in small glasses. The cocktail, a tool for masking bad booze, became the centerpiece of a new form of sophisticated home entertaining that has remained with us ever since. This entire cultural explosion raises a fascinating question for historians. Did Prohibition actually create the Roaring Twenties? Or did it simply accelerate a revolution that was already underway? This is a scholarly debate with compelling arguments on both sides. Some argue that the social shifts were already in motion, powered by the end of World War I, the success of the women's suffrage movement, and the growing urbanization of the country. In this view, the speakeasy didn't create the flapper, it just gave her a place to dance. But other historians argue that by breaking the old saloon culture and forcing social life into new, unregulated, underground spaces, Prohibition directly caused these changes to happen faster and in more radical ways than they otherwise would have. You look around the crowded, noisy, smoke-filled room with a new understanding. This place is not just an illegal bar. It is the beating heart of a revolution. It is a place where social classes and, in some progressive establishments, even races could mingle in ways that were unthinkable before. It is the place where a new kind of woman declared her independence, where a new kind of music found its voice, and where new rules for modern social life were being written every night. Here lies the greatest paradox of the noble experiment. A law, passed by rural, religious traditionalists to promote sobriety and social control, had resulted in the creation of an urban, secular, and wildly liberated new culture. In their attempt to shut down the party, they had accidentally made it more exciting, more glamorous, and more culturally significant than it had ever been before. You are in the heart of the Jazz Age, a secret world of cocktails and cultural revolution that exists in the shadows of the law. The party of the Roaring Twenties seems like it will never end. But outside the speakeasy's hidden door, the decade itself is drawing to a close, and the foundations of this entire glittering, illegal world are beginning to crack. The nation is starting to sober up, not from a change of heart, but from a growing, collective headache caused by the disastrous unintended consequences of its noble experiment. By the late 1920s, the initial optimism that had fueled the passage of the 18th Amendment had all but vanished. The promised benefits of a dry America had failed to materialize. In fact, many of the social ills that Prohibition was meant to cure had seemingly gotten worse. The spectacular violence of organized crime, which had once seemed like a thrilling story in the newspapers, now felt like a national crisis. The open and widespread flouting of the law, from college students to congressmen, was creating a deep and corrosive disrespect for the rule of law itself. And the government's massive enforcement efforts had clearly failed to stop the flow of liquor. The noble experiment was beginning to look like a noble failure. And then, in October of 1929, the party came to a crashing, definitive end. The stock market collapsed, plunging the United States and the world into the Great Depression. This is the mainstream historical fact that served as the final nail in the coffin for Prohibition. The decade of frantic, debt-fueled prosperity was over, replaced by an era of profound economic hardship, mass unemployment, and desperate poverty. And in this new, grim reality, the arguments against Prohibition shifted from the social to the economic, and they became impossible to ignore. The first argument was jobs. With millions of Americans out of work and standing in breadlines, the idea of keeping thousands of breweries, distilleries, bottling plants, and trucking companies legally shuttered seemed insane. The anti-prohibition movement, known as the Wets, began to argue convincingly that repealing the 18th Amendment would create thousands of much-needed, legitimate jobs. The second, and even more powerful, argument was taxes. The federal government's budget had been devastated by the economic collapse, and it was desperate for new sources of revenue to fund relief programs. Meanwhile, a billion-dollar-a-year industry in illegal alcohol was operating completely tax-free, its immense profits flowing directly into the pockets of men like Al Capone. The Wets argued that legalizing and taxing the sale of alcohol would provide a massive, life-saving infusion of cash into the national treasury. The idea of letting gangsters get rich while the government went broke began to seem not just foolish, but deeply unpatriotic. This changing public mood is best illustrated by a quirky and fascinating political turnabout. The original push for Prohibition had been led by powerful women's groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who argued it was necessary to protect the home and family. But now, a new and equally powerful women's group emerged to lead the charge for repeal. The Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform, or the WNPR, was founded by a wealthy and politically connected New York socialite named Pauline Sabine. Sabine and her organization brilliantly co-opted the very same arguments that the Dries had used. They argued that prohibition, far from protecting the family, was actually destroying it. It had created a culture of secret drinking, turned law-abiding citizens into criminals, glamorized the gangster, and worst of all, it had exposed their children to the cynical, hypocritical world of the speakeasy. It was a masterful political reversal, and it shattered the idea that all respectable women supported prohibition. This all leads to a scholarly debate that continues to this day. What was the true, primary driver for the repeal of prohibition? Was it, as many argue, a pragmatic and purely economic decision, a desperate response to the fiscal crisis of the Great Depression that made the moral arguments of the Dries seem like an unaffordable luxury? Or was it a broader social and moral rejection of the law? Had the public simply grown tired of the crime, the corruption, the hypocrisy, and the government's intrusion into their private lives? The reality is that these two forces, the economic and the social, were perfectly intertwined, creating a powerful, unstoppable political movement. You can feel this shift all around you. The politician who once praised the virtues of a dry nation now speaks of the economic benefits of legal beer. The newspapers that once condemned the evils of the saloon now publish editorials about the need for new tax revenue. The Democratic Party, in the presidential election of 1932, makes the repeal of prohibition a central plank of its platform, and its candidate, Franklin D. Roosevelt, rides a wave of public support to a landslide victory. The grand coalition of moral reformers who had passed the 18th Amendment has crumbled. It has been replaced by a new, and even more powerful, coalition. Working-class voters who want their beer back, business leaders who see an opportunity for new industry, and a desperate government that needs the money. The noble experiment, born in an era of post-war optimism and moral certainty, cannot survive in a new age of economic desperation and profound cynicism. The end is near. The only question left is when, and how, the final curtain will fall. The year is 1932. The nation is in the depths of the Great Depression, and the public has turned decisively against the noble experiment. The political will to maintain prohibition has evaporated, crushed under the weight of rampant crime, widespread hypocrisy, and a desperate need for jobs and tax revenue. The only question left is how to dismantle the complex legal machinery of the 18th Amendment. The end comes not all at once, but in two decisive steps. The first sign of the coming thaw arrives in March of 1933. The newly elected president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had campaigned on a platform of repealing prohibition, signs the Cullen-Harrison Act. This clever piece of legislation didn't end prohibition outright, but it amended the old Volstead Act, declaring that beer with an alcohol content of 3.2% was not, in fact, an intoxicating beverage. It was a legal workaround, a way to get the breweries working and the beer flowing while the slow process of constitutional repeal was underway. After signing the act, Roosevelt famously remarked to the press, "I think this would be a good time for a beer." The country agreed. On April 7, 1933, legal beer went on sale for the first time in 13 years, and massive, joyous crowds lined up outside the breweries. The dam was beginning to break. The final, definitive end, however, required something that had never been done before in American history, the repeal of a constitutional amendment. This brings us to our final mainstream historical fact. Congress proposed the 21st Amendment, a simple and direct text that just said the 18th Amendment was hereby repealed. It was then sent to the states for ratification, not by their legislatures, but by special state conventions, a process thought to be faster and more reflective of the popular will. Throughout 1933, state after state voted for repeal. The nation watched the tally like scoreboard. And on the evening of December 5, 1933, the state of Utah, of all places, became the 36th state to ratify the 21st Amendment, providing the three-quarters majority needed. The news flashed across the country via radio and telegraph. It was official. The noble experiment was over. The reaction was instantaneous and jubilant. Spontaneous celebrations erupted in cities across the country. People danced in the streets. The old speakeasies threw open their doors, no longer needing the pretense of secrecy. In hotels and restaurants, waiters began ceremoniously tearing the wine list pages out of old menus. The unofficial anthem of Roosevelt's campaign, the song "Happy Days Are Here Again," became the soundtrack to a national sigh of relief. The 13-year-long thirst was finally over. This leads to a quirky and wonderful tidbit of corporate resilience. The great American brewing companies, like Anheuser-Busch, had been forced to find creative ways to survive the long drought. They had converted their massive facilities to produce other products, a near beer called Bevo, ice cream, corn syrup, and even truck bodies for police vans. But they had kept their breweries in pristine condition, waiting for this very day. As soon as repeal was announced, they were ready. Famously, August Bush Jr. arranged for a celebratory case of Budweiser to be delivered to President Roosevelt at the White House by a magnificent team of their Clydesdale horses, a brilliant piece of public relations that has become a famous part of their brand ever since. As the celebrations die down, however, we are left with the final, great scholarly debate of the Prohibition era. Looking back, what was its ultimate effect on the nation's health? The Dries had always warned that repeal would lead to a massive increase in the social ills of alcoholism. The Wets argued that the public health disaster of poisoned bootleg liquor was far worse. So, what happened? The data is complex. After 1933, rates of alcohol-related diseases like cirrhosis of the liver did indeed begin to climb again. But the new system of legal, regulated, and taxed alcohol also eliminated the problem of methanol poisoning and dismantled the criminal empires that had terrorized the nation. Historians on both sides of the issue can find statistics to support their case, and the debate over whether the repeal was a net positive or negative for public health continues. You are now sitting in a newly legal bar. It is brightly lit. There is a sign out front. You order a simple glass of beer, and it is served to you without a password, without a teacup, and without the fear of it being poison. The world feels simpler, more honest. You look back on the strange journey you have just taken. The Noble Experiment was one of the most fascinating and spectacular failures in American history. It was an attempt to legislate morality that instead created a golden age for organized crime. It was an attempt to protect the family that gave rise to the speakeasy and the flapper. It was an attempt to promote public health that ended up poisoning thousands of its own citizens. The legacy of Prohibition is all around you. It's in the cocktail you drink, in the existence of the FBI which grew to fight the gangsters it created, and in the profound and lasting American skepticism towards government attempts to regulate private life. The long, strange, and often violent party of the Roaring Twenties is over, and a new era has begun. And now, as you finish that first, satisfying, legal drink, it is time for our story to end as well. Let the sound of the distant jazz band begin to fade into a soft, gentle hum. The bright lights of the newly opened bars grow dim and distant in your mind. The clatter of glasses and the cheerful voices of the celebration all melt away, leaving only a comfortable and profound quiet. The long, complicated story of the last 13 years, the speakeasies, the gangsters, the flappers, the law, it all recedes, becoming just another chapter in a history book, resting quietly on a shelf. There are no more laws to navigate, no more passwords to remember. There is only the feeling of your own quiet room, the gentle weight of your blanket, and the effortless rhythm of your own breathing. Let all the stories and all the thoughts of the day dissolve, and allow yourself to drift off into a peaceful, well-deserved, and deeply restful sleep.
dàn tới đây luôn á. Lấy máy là quay gửi cho anh Thịnh.
Quay nó có lỗ đâu, không quay không có lỗ. Nó xịn kìa chứ nói này quay đâu.
Thì chớp chớp nhán nhán được rồi. Dàn tới đây luôn á. Lấy máy là quay gửi cho anh Thịnh.
Quay
chớp chớp nhán nhán được rồi. tới đây luôn á. Lấy máy là quay gửi cho anh Thịnh.
Quay nó không có đỏ đâu, không quay nó không có đỏ. Nói xịn kìa chứ nói này quay đâu.
Thì chớp chớp nhán nhán được rồi.